Hey there, I'm Ellie Eberts. Recently, I started making a historically inspired Sophie Hatter cosplay from Howl's Moving Castle. This is one of my favorite movies, and I think a lot of you can relate. It's a movie that was really impactful, and it just means a lot to me. I've actually cosplayed Sophie before, many years ago, but I've decided that I want to remake her iconic dress with a bit of historical flair. A few weeks ago, I went over the basics of Edwardian underwear. If you missed that video, you can check it out in the iCard above. Today, I am going to be focusing on making the combination to go under my Sophie costume. A combination is the bottommost layer that an Edwardian woman would be wearing. It combines the chemise and the drawers into one garment. I'm taking my inspiration from this beautiful combination housed at the Met and this equally beautiful yet a bit more simple combination from the Jettee Museum. I'm starting by creating a pattern for the drawers. It's pretty remarkable the resources that can be found for historical costuming. I'm actually making this pattern following the instructions in a 1906 sewing manual called The American System of Dressmaking. This book can be found as public domain from the Library of Congress. Instructions for these drawers can be found on page 496, and I'll be sure to link the full book in the description box. Drafting the drawers was actually pretty simple. The instructions are straightforward and all based on math. I'm using the back of wrapping paper as my pattern paper. Most wrapping paper has 1-inch squares on the back, which really helped in drafting my pattern. Once my drawer pattern was drafted, I created a half mock-up to test the fit. The only adjustment I felt was necessary was on the hem of the drawers, in order to make it more like my inspiration from the Met. Next, I drafted the pattern for the top of my combination. Again, I followed instructions from the American System of Dressmaking. These instructions are on page number 12 and are for the basic bodice sloper. Admittedly, these instructions were much harder to follow than for the drawers. There were some phrases that didn't really make sense in modern English. Like, from P, draw line 9 parallel with line 8, making it the length of dart measure minus the width of the back of neck, which is 1/6 of the neck measure on the scale of 6th. What the heck does that mean? I still have no idea what that means. But after a few tries, I finally figured everything out and came out with a working pattern. Here's a look at my first mock-up. While the fit was really nice, I wanted my combination to have a bit more fullness at the front. So I cut a slash down the center of my pattern and spread it to create more fullness. I don't really talk a lot about pattern alteration on my channel, but this is called the slash and spread method and is generally used to give more fullness to any sort of garment, like a sleeve or, in our case, a bodice. After slashing and spreading my pattern, I created another mock-up and was pretty happy with the fit of this one. With my patterns completed, I still had a few notes. When cutting my pattern, I needed to add a button placket to the front of my pattern. I also needed another inch or so of room in the center back of the bodice. Lastly, I needed to adjust the neckline. Otherwise, my patterns were ready to go. With my patterns prepared, I began cutting my materials. I'm using a beautiful cotton voile from fabric.com. I cut 2 copies of my drawer pattern, 2 of my front bodice, and 1 of my back bodice. Part of what makes Edwardian undergarments so beautiful is the abundance of lace, especially insertion lace, which, when applied properly, looks like it was made as part of the fabric. I'm adding a strip of insertion lace along the side seam of my combination, starting by adding it to the sides of each of my drawer pieces. I started by pinning the lace in place, then I stitched the lace onto the cotton, stitching as close to the edge of the lace as possible. Next, I turned the piece over and cut open the fabric behind the lace. After pressing these seam allowances over twice, I hand-stitched them into place with a blind stitch. I've heard that in some historical teachings, they actually tell you to count the threads between stitches, but that's a bit intense for me, so I simply did a regular blind stitch. The end result is a beautifully clean seam that is nearly invisible from the right side. Drawers from the 1900s were left open at the crotch, but in order to keep my fabric from fraying, I needed to add a facing to these openings. From my pattern, I cut a 3-inch wide facing. I stitched this onto the crotch openings and understitched the seam allowance onto the facing. Once stitched, I pressed it over and hemmed the edge of the facing with a blind stitch. Once the lace was inserted and my facings were in place, I closed up both of my legs with a French seam. And now it's time for more lace. I'm using this beautiful embroidered tulle lace as a ruffle, with this ribbon insertion lace as an in-between. I began by gathering the embroidered lace, then pinning it to the hem of my legs, with the seam allowance on the right side. I left an opening in the lace on the outside of the legs, where our insertion lace is. This gap is left so that the suspenders from the corset have a place to slip through without causing too much disturbance to the drawers. Once this ruffle was stitched into place, I attached my ribbon insertion lace. This lace has a border that made it really easy to stitch on straight. Once the bottom edge was stitched into place, I pressed the lace upward and folded over the other side seam allowance. This was then stitched on by hand. I love how adorable this ribbon lace is, especially after you add the ribbon. I picked this super pretty peach satin ribbon, and I think it really adds an extra layer of cuteness to this combination. With our drawers completed, it's now time to move on to the bodice. I began by piecing together my bodice at the side seams. Following my inspiration, I decided to add insertion lace up the side seams, following the same steps as we did on the drawers. Most combinations close up the front with buttons. I included a 1-inch button placket on my pattern. This was pressed and stitched into place. Next, I finished my shoulder seams with French seams. Now I'm going to finish off the neckline of the bodice. For the neckline, I'm taking inspiration from this simpler combination. I started by adding some embroidered lace, the same that I used on the legs. This lace is rather large, so I ended up chopping off most of it and only using about 1 or 2 inches of the actual lace bit. Next, I added some ribbon insertion lace to cover the seam. This is a smaller variation than what I used on the legs, but it's a similar design. Now I'm going to add some buttonholes. Buttonholes of the 1900s were likely done by hand, but my Bernina has a buttonhole feature which is much more time efficient. After selecting my buttons, I traced the size of my button onto a scrap of cotton. After a few attempts, I got a buttonhole that was the right size. My machine is pretty smart and it remembers the last buttonhole I did, so after I got it right the first time, it was easy to zip through the rest of the buttons. I sliced open my buttonholes with my snips, then I copied the placement of my buttonholes onto the other side of my bodice and hand-stitched on my buttons. Finally, I need to finish the arm's eyes on my bodice. I got this adorable peach lace that matches the peach of my ribbons. While I could have created a facing to finish these seams, I decided to take the easy route and use twill tape. I sandwiched my lace between my cotton and twill tape, and once this was stitched into place, I pressed it over and top stitched to hold the twill tape in place. I don't think that this is a historically accurate method, but it was super easy and gave me a really nice clean finish. Now that we have a bodice and some legs, it's time to combine them. Get it? Combination? Combine? I placed my bodice on my counter and began pinning my legs to the bodice at the waist with wrong sides together. I began by matching the lace at the side seams. The back of the drawers should overlap by a few inches, and then I pin that into place as well. After these main points were pinned, I gathered the rest of the material to fit. Wrangling all this material turned out to be a bit of a challenge, so I stitched the waist together in chunks. After the back was stitched, I flipped the combination over and began pinning the front pieces. These were pinned so that the edge of the drawers matched the edge of the bodice. All extra material was gathered to fit. Now that my combination was actually combined, I could finish off the waist with another piece of lace. I used the same ribbon insertion lace that I used on my legs and attached it by hand. Here's a look at my finished combination. To be honest, this is actually really cute. I wasn't sure that underwear from the 1900s could be considered cute, but I feel adorable in this. The moment I first put it on, I like jumped around. I was so excited by how adorable it was. They're so fucking cute! The lace at the hem of the drawers is extra cute, and I love how floofy and like flooshy and swooshy? Yeah. I like how swooshy the drawers are. I think that all that extra room in the bottom just looks really cute. It's adorable. Plus, the little buttons and all the lace along the neckline make me really happy. It's just so adorable. Next, I'm going to begin working on the corset for my Sophie costume. You can expect to see that video in a few weeks, so if you're looking forward to it, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so that way you get a notification when it comes out. Of course, a big thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon. You guys are incredible and are honestly the reason that I'm able to make all these videos. So thank you very, very much. Of course, if you don't already, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Instagram, go to my Twitter, all that good jazz. You know what to do. And I will see you in the next video. Until then, everyone, be sure to keep sewing, stay positive, and have fun, and I will see you next time. Bye!